All right, folks, I'm going to do this one last time because it's much easier, frankly, to do this. If you're like, oh, I've already seen this twice, then go to the next video. I'm going to tell you, it's easier than typing out to this person. So, to this user, which I'll try to tag in the video, although I don't know if it'll let me tag you, but in any case, he's now changed or clarified his argument to say that, well, the 600 holds its own with the 1000 until, top end. And he says he wasn't referring to speed. He's referring to, where it is in the power band. And he goes on to say, because of the laws of physics, the 600cc bike, because it has smaller pistons, less reciprocating mass, it'll rev up quicker and it'll get up to its power band faster than the 1000 will spin up. And that will get it to its power band quicker. And therefore, it will pull ahead of the 600 or the 1000 until the 1000 can get spun up and make its greater power. That only works on a test bed. If you have an engine sitting on a bench and it's not connected to sprockets and a chain and a tire and a 420-pound bike, yeah, a 600 could rev up quicker. I mean, because of the issues of inertia and what he mentioned. Although 1000s rev up almost as fast, and while they have more reciprocating mass and maybe have a heavier flywheel, they also have bigger explosions making more power, which might overcome that. But let's just assume that he's right, that an engine will split. That it doesn't matter once you connect it to a bike and it's going through gearing and chain and has drivetrain losses, and then it has to physically move the bike down the road. If you can rev your 600 and it goes from 0, or whatever, 1,000 RPM idle to 16,000 in the blink of a second, well, it's not going to do that when it's in gear and you hit the gas. It's going to pull because it's not making any power. Now you're not looking at the inertia of the motor. The motor is going to be held back. The motor is going to try to spin, but the chain connected to the countershaft, which is connected to the flywheel, all that stuff, is physically going to hold that motor back from spinning and going zzz, zzz. It won't do that when it's in gear. Okay? You're missing a very important point, to the point I wonder if I'm being punked here and I'm wasting my time, or if I'm talking to an idiot. I want to give you the benefit of the doubt that you're not an idiot and that you just forgot that point or you're punking me. But here's the thing. When it's connected to, look at the Lexus LFA motor. That V10 is a masterpiece of engineering. So much so that that thing would rev from 1,000 or whatever the RPM was at idle up to its red line, which is like something crazy like 8,500 or 9,000 or something like that. It would rev up and back down to idle in like 1 second, which for a 5-liter V10 is amazing. And it was so fast, it would gain and lose rev so quickly that they couldn't build or find an analog rev counter that could keep pace. It would always be like a lag. It couldn't show it properly. So they had to go to a TFT display with a high refresh rate that could go zzz, because that's like how fast it is. Well, that's fine, but if you load that engine into the car or put it in a dump truck, it's not going to go zzz. It's going to, because it's not going to be able to rev unless your clutch is slipping, right? If it's in gear, it's the inertia of the motor is far less relevant in that case now, because the much greater inertia comes from moving the bike itself. An object at rest wants to stay at rest, and so taking a bike, whatever it's at, and trying to get it to overcome its own inertia and accelerate is what's going to limit how quickly that bike could rev. If you don't believe me, rev your bike in the garage and then go out at 3,500 RPMs on a 600 and first gear and whack the throttle. And you wait and you wait, and the revs slowly climb, and then they'll climb a little faster, and then he gets the power up here. It takes like 6 seconds. So you just can't look at it the way that he's looking at it. It's crazy to even think that way. And so, there is one thing on the 600s that I hadn't considered, that they do typically come with shorter gearing. My ZX10 stock gearing is geared to go like 197 or 200 or something stupid. It doesn't even do that out of the box. You got to get the ECU flash and all that other stuff. So, a 600 struggle to hit a legit 160. Unless you do a lot of work to them, most 600s with a power command or ECU flash and a slip-on, they're going to go 155, 158. Maybe on a good day, you got a strong one. You got a Monday version of an R6, you do 161 maybe. But like Moto America, pro-built race bikes are only doing mid 160s. Same thing with Isleman TT race bikes. They're only hitting mid-high 160s. That's just what they do. It's what a 600 does. They're fighting air. And when you got a bike that's only making 120, 125, maybe the bikes in Moto America a little stronger and they're hitting 164, 165, maybe 166. But those are super stock builds with pro riders and all the tweaks and all the stuff that they could possibly do. And they've thrown more money into that than you spent on that one bike than you spent on your car. Yeah, they'll get a few extra miles an hour, but typically your 600 is going to top out. A good rule of thumb is 155 to 160. Not what your dash says. Your dash is wrong. It's always wrong. It's just a matter of, is it only 4% low high or 8% high? And it varies from bike to bike, year to year, and whether you made gearing changes. But I didn't forget to take into account that a 600 does have lower gearing. And that will make a 600 accelerate stronger. Even though it has less power, your gearing is leverage. It's mechanical advantage. It's how it applies that force. You get a longer bar. You can pry and put more force on something and lift something with like a lever. Well, your rear sprocket acts as that lever. The smaller the front sprocket or the larger the rear sprocket or a combination thereof increases your mechanical advantage, which would increase your acceleration. But that gets into a whole other argument. Well, are you running stock gearing versus aftermarket gearing? And now it's less about 600 versus 1000 and more about, well, how did you gear your bike? And while you can gear a bike down for power, you can gear it down for acceleration. You're not changing the power. But when you do that, your speed in each gear is going to go down drastically, which means you're shifting way more often, which means you're losing time there. It also will clip your top speed tremendously, and you'll be going down Main Street at 35 miles an hour with the engine screaming if you go low enough, right? So there's always these trade-offs and stuff. But assuming both bikes are geared, because, yeah, you could gear down to 600. You can also gear down to 1000. So, let's compare apples to apples here. So he was saying, well, it's not really until, you get up there that the bike makes more power. There is no point where this 600 line, which was a piped and tuned ZX6R versus a 2021 R1, there is no point where these things converge. There is no point where the 600 is making anywhere near the same power. We couldn't even run the dyno down where we started the R1. The R1 over here at just over 3,000 RPMs was only making 25 horsepower. I mean, that's low. You're lugging the motor. If we did that on the 600, it'd be down here at like 9 horsepower or 11 horsepower or 12 horsepower, and the bike would stall. It'd be bad for the motor. So we had to find an RPM that for that bike wasn't quite bogging and killing the motor. So we couldn't even start the damn dyno run on a 600 because it didn't even hit 34, almost 35 horsepower until 5,200 RPMs. That's how little 600s make. 600s don't make any torque. Look at your torque line here. Just make it red to make it more stand out. Your torque down here, you're talking, it just has nothing. If we're at, you got 34 foot-pounds of torque. That's nothing. That's like a Ninja 300 at peak. It's just maybe a Ninja 400. It just doesn't making any power. And so as you rev it, you got to rev the nuts off of it. You get up to like, 8,000 RPMs. Well, certainly by there, you're halfway through the rev. You're making 54 horsepower versus 105 on the 1,000. When you get up here to, 10,000, man, now you're starting to boogie. The engine's starting to scream. Yeah, you're up to 75 horsepower versus 143. You're like, all right, well, you get that 600 spun up, get it up to 12,000, man, then you're really cooking. Yeah, you're pushing 100 horsepower now. It is starting to move. It's decent horsepower. You're pushing damn near 170 here. You get up to your peak. All right, man, I am at 14,000 RPM. Remember, you can say, the bike revs out to here. Yeah, but most 600s, including your R6 that revs to the moon, they make their peak horsepower way before red line. And then they start dropping down. So the more you rev it, the less horsepower you make. So you want to shift right in this area here around peak. And then your RPMs drop to here and you build back up. This is your power band. Your power band on a 600 is very narrow. because you're not even, I mean, you drop back down to 12,000 RPMs and what are you making? 99 horsepower. So you want to stay between this 99 and 109, or on a newer 600, maybe it's 110 to 120. You want to stay in that 11, 12,000 on up to 14, 15, depending on the tune, flash, and configuration. But you want to stay in this section here because that's the only place you make any real goddamn power. Well, guess what? You're making here at peak what the 1000 is making back here around 8,000. I mean, it's so not even close. And you can say, well, what about his theory about, well, it revs up quicker? And okay, well, let's look at time. But first of all, I want to think about this for a second. We can look at time. The problem with it here is because the 600 makes so little power that we couldn't really run it on the dyno without really kind of lugging the hell out of it and putting strain on the motor. We had to start here. The 1000, we started at 3,056. We didn't start until 5,200 up here. So there's a 2,200 RPM distance. So when you graph this on time to see, well, does the thing spin up faster? It's going to be misleading, but let's see how it works. But I'm going to predict this right now because this didn't start until much later. This one was already starting here and had to work through 2,200 RPMs to get to where this one started. So I'm guessing this is probably going to slide this over a bit, and they're probably going to touch somewhere here. So if we go in here and use time, yeah, okay, it did that. So the bottom one's actually shifted over like this much where it shouldn't be. But even then you can say, well, okay, that would have moved it over to here. The peak would have been over here. They would have been hitting around the same time. Remember, the red line starts at 5,200. This started at 3,000. And so it's like, if you're looking at time, it's from when it started. So you basically gave 2,200 RPM head start to the 600. And so did it reach its peak before this one did? Not really. If you adjusted it for the 2 seconds, which I haven't figured out a way to do that, you'd find that they're hitting their peaks at about the same time. But let's just say for magical purposes, this actually hit its peak before this one did. Okay. This one hit its peak at 109. This is pushing 163. This doesn't need to hit its peak to beat this one's peak. That's the point I'm trying to get across to this dude. This one, even if it revved up and got to its peak a second quicker, 2 seconds quicker, it's still fighting. It's maxed out at 109. It got to 109, but by the time it hit 109 horsepower, this thing is hitting 163 horsepower. It's not even at its peak. It's going to keep going and leave this thing even further behind. But even at this point, you pick any point adjusted for time, 90 versus 112. As you go on here, this one hits 103, that's 145 horsepower. You get out here at 6 seconds, we're making 108 to 166. This has a 55 horsepower advantage. And if you think 55 horses and double the torque, look at the torque difference, 39, which is rounded up, 40 to 75. You don't think that 35 foot-pounds of torque and an extra 55 horsepower is going to pull harder and is going to accelerate you faster and leave this one behind? He's talking about physics and all this stuff, and he doesn't freaking understand it. There is no, if we're talking on a lap times, on a small track versus a big track, if we're talking about 8th mile and you really geared down the damn small bike, the 600, so that it, the top speed's now 125, but you got crazy short gearing on a really short stretch of road. Yeah, there's situations where you can make a 600 very quick for a very short spurt of acceleration, but you're giving up rideability, you're giving up top speed, you're giving up everything. You're making it a one-trick pony. If we're talking stock bike to stock bike or mod for mod, there is no place where that 600 is ever in the ballpark of this. And this is misleading. This is making the 600 look better than it should, because this thing started 2,200 RPMs. After this, it had that jump. It had a head start. It's like giving it a 2-second head start. This point on the chart on the red, This whole red should be shifted over here the way that it is there. But obviously at the time, years ago, I didn't have any way to go, well, in the future, some idiot's going to question me on this, and I'm going to have to chart against time, and I need both starting RPMs to be the same so that it doesn't skew and move them this way. There's no point that that thing is even close. Even like by giving it the 2-second head start, it's like, okay, you gave it a 2-second head start. Technically, it had a little bit more here, and it used it up by 1.2 seconds. That advantage was gone. And then you went to 2 seconds, and now it's 6 horsepower behind. And it's doing okay here. Again, fudging the numbers, 2 seconds in the favor of the 600, not the 1000. The 1000 is having the results skewed against it. And then you just go, okay, now all of a sudden, boom, you watch this gulf open up, not on the top end. We're not even out here yet. It's pulling a massive gap within seconds. That's why when you look at 60, I'm not talking about, well, just quarter mile times or 0 to 60. Look at 60 to 40 to 80, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 100 roll-on times, where both bikes are in the same gear, and they go whoop and hit the throttle. And you'll see on average a 600 will take 4 seconds or high 3s, and the 1000 takes low 2s. It just always pulls harder. The whole premise of, well, it holds its own until the top end. No, it doesn't. It can't. It physically can't. It doesn't rev faster. It revs faster on a test bench, not when the bike is holding it back. It's only going to rev as far if you made the bike 100 pounds lighter. Yeah, then the 600 could rev through it faster because it's not the inertia of the internal components in the pistons. It's now the major force is the inertia of the bike that it's trying to move. The engine cannot spin freely when it's physically tethered by a chain to the back wheel, which has got friction with the ground. It's how this works, dude. If you doubt me and you want to keep arguing, let's get on a Zoom call and go through all this stuff. And I'll see if I can line up with a tuner and engine builder who will explain it to you, and a former racer who will go through this stuff and tell you why you're wrong. This isn't to say 600 suck or they can't be track weapons or up in the mountains where the 1000, you can't use all this freaking power up in the mountains. I know that. Everybody knows that. I've mentioned that several times. But, that's a different discussion. That's talking about agility and braking and all these other things, transitions, about a lighter bike, and the fact that this horsepower might be more of a liability than an asset when you're in hairpins. Yeah, I can argue that. I agree. I've said that many times. But looking at this, no. There's no way. The bikes are only 30 pounds different. Maximum. You're talking about 420-ish versus 440-ish. It's not that much of a weight difference. It just isn't. It's certainly not enough. If every 7 pounds is equal to like a horsepower, okay, let's just say that this weighs a whopping, let's be really generous just to make the math easy. Let's say that the 600 is 35 pounds lighter than the 1000. Okay, that'll take, essentially when it comes to acceleration and stuff, that would effectively reduce that from 168 to 163 versus 100. It's not gonna make a difference. It would be negligible. You'd be looking at like hundredths of a second if you had a draggy or something like that. This is how it works, man. I don't know how else to explain it other than using charts and logic and, explaining it as I am. But there is at no point, whether we look at it here through horsepower, based on RPM, whether we go in here and look at time and even acknowledge that basically this one started at a much higher RPM than this, and it still doesn't paint the picture of, well, it only pulls away when it gets to the top end. No. Look at the absolute chasm, the absolute gulf of performance here and horsepower and torque that exists everywhere here in the mid-range. It's not just here. It's not just that one number. It's everywhere. So your premise is wrong. That's all I can say. I don't feel like typing all this out, so I did this.